My memories of Night of the Living Dead were vague, given I'd probably only watched it once in the last 20 years, and I chose to revisit it recently because of its thematic crossover with today's coronavirus pandemic. It's got an infectious disease that everyone fears, it's got a lockdown of sorts, which is a group of people boarding themselves up indoors for almost a whole runtime. That was the trigger for my rewatch, even though the coronavirus parallel is unintended, of course. 1968 this movie was made, so it's not going to be an intended parallel. But it was a surprisingly strong rewatch experience. The film is cheap as hell in its technical execution. The special effects by today's standards look like something a group of film students would cook up. The premise of the film was refreshing when the movie came out, but since then its horror scenario of a group of people trapped and being killed one by one has been repeated over and over and over in other horror movies, from the Evil Dead and Friday the 13th franchises to Alien to The Thing. Maybe the idea of a small group of humans trapped and fighting off predatory enemies appeals to some primordial instinct that used to serve a practical purpose of fighting off wild animals and rival clans of cavemen. Zombies, in a sense, are like dumb cavemen. I knew the film has been historically cliched by its many imitators since, and so I was expecting my new viewing to be spoiled by that factor, and yet I enjoyed my rewatch of this film far more than I expected, though I quite like the sequels Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, which have far superior special effects and much more daring levels of gore, and in some cases greater themes. Somehow I still find Night of the Living Dead a more consistently engaging movie than those two. Obviously, the inferior special effects, gore and technical execution are not the superior factors in this original version. Rather, I find that the characters and story structure here are better. But first, some discussion of ways in which Night of the Living Dead is aesthetically effective, using creative directorial and editing choices that are low on cost but high on return. The 4:3 screen ratio seems to work well because the film is set in a confined space. Widescreen is great for showing open landscapes, but indoors I think 4:3 tends to work better. It captures more of the vertical humans without unnecessary side screen areas filled with nothing but plain interior walls. Recently, the horror movie The Lighthouse made great use of an even more horizontally restricted screen ratio. The director said it was to create a restrictive, claustrophobic vibe, and maybe the 4:3 achieves the same in Night of the Living Dead. In terms of camera work, there is very sloppy stuff like something overlapping the lower edge of the camera here, but the empty stillness of the opening title shots is a nice contrast with the shaky handheld camera work when the zombies start to attack later. Dutch tilts give a sense of unbalancing in many scenes too. Costs nothing to do, but it's effective. But for some reason a lot of horror directors don't seem to think to use Dutch tilts in their movies. The black and white cinematography, plus the presence of mostly leafless and thus dead-looking trees in an empty landscape, this gives the impression that the entire setting of the film is a big graveyard, whether we see headstones or not. An interesting shot choice here pans down from a cluster of branches to the introductory characters, like the dead tree is a threat to them in some way. And then we have the film noir lighting inside the house, dark threatening shadows that don't make physical sense a lot of the time, but they have an emotional effect. These elements help the movie, but they weren't groundbreaking even when the movie came out. They're just old reliable. The musical score is mostly very effective, though from what I've read, most of the music was taken from other horror movies. In other words, it wasn't an original horror score. But that's okay. A lot of great movies have brilliant soundtracks that use stock music. There's a lot of emphasis on hypnotic echoing in the musical choices as well. At the beginning of the movie and at various other points, the music sounds like something from a UFO film. This fits with the sci-fi plot element of an infection being brought back by a space probe that's been to Venus, but at the same time it's hypnotic in the general sense, and it fits with the spaced out nature of the zombies. The film was more gory than any other zombie film that came before it, to my knowledge anyway, and I may be wrong on this as there's a lot of old zombie films I haven't seen, but I think Night of the Living Dead was the first zombie film to really push the idea that protagonists are under threat of being eaten alive by zombie hordes. The idea of such a nasty death gives strong narrative drive to the protagonist's survival efforts, and it ups the audience fear level. And a whole genre of zombie imitation movies and games and comics and books has all come out of this. Particularly good is the incremental plot revelations. The word zombie isn't even used in the film. The word ghoul tends to get used instead, which is nice because it adds a sort of ghost story feel. Throughout the story, the nature and motivation of the zombies is revealed in gradual stages, partially by what we see of them in action, such as their hunger, eating insects and whatnot, and partially by a series of radio and TV broadcasts that the protagonists watch. These reports are carefully scripted as part of the slow plot reveal throughout the movie. The flesh-eating aspect is hinted at when Barbara finds a corpse in the house, but for all we know it could just be a rotting corpse, but then the blood is still dripping, so the person hasn't been dead for long. After the radio finally states outright the fact that zombies eat flesh, this happens later on, Ben goes back up to the body and we can see from the legs that the body hasn't rotted away, and so the face had been eaten away by a zombie after all. Nasty. A TV news interviewee talks of a corpse that had its limbs removed but it still awakened and tried to move. This isn't shown, but the gore is implied. This saves on special effects and avoids offending the senses. They had enough complaints against the film's gore anyway, mainly because the film was unbelievably shown without an age certification in a lot of cinemas, so kids were allowed to go and watch Night of the Living Dead on the cinema. This film was shocking enough for adults when it came out, so the kids must have been petrified. Thank God the film was in black and white. For this stuff to be seen in colour in 1968, that would have been too much. It's the same paradigm as Hitchcock's Psycho actually. That film's shower murder scene managed to get past the censors, but if it had been in colour, it probably wouldn't have. Anyway, back to the incrementally increasing horror and plot revelations. Only in the last 20 odd minutes of the film do we finally see zombies eating human flesh, which is a great setup for the final zombie horde attack that occurs just 6 minutes later. And in between that, the TV reveals the essential plot point that destroying a zombie's brain kills it. This makes Ben able to kill off the zombie versions of Harry and Helen in the basement. Prior to this scene, he had been shooting torsos to no effect. So there's a good sense of gradual but consistent escalation in terms of the enemy threat. The best monster films tend to follow this structural pattern. And this is a key reason why a lot of horror sequels aren't as effective as the originals, even if they are more well made. When watching a horror sequel, the audience already knows the nature of the beast from the beginning of the movie. The surprise revelation elements are lost. And so a good monster sequel should do something new with the monster, have some new revelations like the Queen alien turning up at the end of Aliens. There are other details that play into the slow revelation in Night of the Living Dead, even though they don't make a lot of sense in practical terms if you stop and think about it. The first zombie we see just comes off like a madman. We don't even know that he's dead or wants to eat human flesh. He appears to have no injuries, so it doesn't make sense that he's become a zombie in the first place. Did he dig his way out of a recently buried coffin? That would be hard to do from 6 feet under. He moves faster than the zombies we see later in the movie, and he seems to be angry while the later zombies are expressionless. He even understands the concept of door handles. Look, he's trying to open the car door. And he is far quicker to use and more efficient at using handheld weapons than the zombies later in the film. I think this is a good bit of directorial deception, playing into the gradual revelation story structure. Let the audience think of this enemy as just being some sort of crazy madman, and then gradually introduce the deathly zombie elements later on. It's a shame the title of the movie gives away the fact that the monsters are dead already, because I think a title which hid that particular plot element might have even made the slow revelation of the nature of the zombies more effective. Being that the zombies are dead people brought back to life, near enough all of them should be at least partially eaten in appearance. But the film holds back on this too, gradually introducing zombie injuries so that they become more grotesque as the story unfolds. Again, it doesn't make sense literally, but it does in terms of incrementally increasing the horror. The radio reports are also good in that they expand the story context. The film starts with the personal trauma of Barbara and gradually introduces more characters, while the radio reports give us gradual awareness of the horror spreading way beyond the context of the isolated house. The reports are straight exposition, descriptions of the plot, and it works better coming from news broadcasts than having the main characters describe everything for us. That would make their dialogue seem unnatural. There's also an excellent contrast in that while the idea of the dead coming back to life and eating people is silly, the film does a good job of portraying a governmental response that is convincing. It's surprising how an audience can emotionally engage with an unrealistic monster scenario if the human characters respond to that threat in a convincing way. A particularly good aspect of this is that a lot of the news reports play as background secondary information while the central characters are engaged in other activities. As Ben finds a gun and works on boarding up the doors and windows, which is communicated visually, there is also moody music and expositional radio reports playing at the same time.
As ordinary looking people, misshapen monsters, people who look like they're in a trance, and things that look like people but act like animals.
So a simultaneous triple information effect. A lot of movies hamper themselves by making individual scenes achieve just one narrative point each, but that's boring and drags out the movie runtime. Night of the Living Dead is just under 1 hour 37 minutes because it crams a lot of plot and character information into individual scenes so that those plot points overlap each other. At some points, the radio and TV spoken news reports are heard on top of dialogue between the on-screen protagonists. In some moments this conveys bits of plot information, and at other times it subliminally plays up the horror with key phrases that are heard in isolation. Here, for example, the phrase "savage killers" is slipped in.
If anything should try to break in here, I can hear it from up there. I'll be down to take care of it. Everything.
And it's a good contrast there. He's trying to calm her down and feel better, and yet the radio is pushing fear at the same time. The news reports also provide important motivation for the characters. The young girl is injured and will likely die, so the government's advice to get her to a safe zone for treatment, this prompts their escape attempt. At the same time, the news reports provide a misplaced sense of hope that the protagonists will somehow escape from all this. And this is where I think a major strength of this movie comes into play. Far too many horror movies involve a group of people trapped and being killed one by one, and a central protagonist who ends up surviving it all. Even the remake of Night of the Living Dead had this. An early script draft for the original Night of the Living Dead that I found online does actually have the character Barbara as the lone survivor at the end of the story, but in the finished movie she is dragged out to be eaten alive, presumably. All of the characters die in this story, which makes it a true horror film. And this is common to a lot of the best horror films. In the marvellous 2018 horror movie Hereditary, one of the few decent modern horrors, evil wins outright at the end. And the same with Rosemary's Baby. The Thing is another example, two protagonists left alive, with probably only one of them being human, but we know that the surviving human will freeze to death anyway. There are some great horror films that do have survivors at the end, but the happyish endings tend to be weak. The Shining takes an in-the-middle approach. We see two protagonists escaping, but we don't see a happy aftermath. Our view stays in the haunted hotel. So that's an interesting middle ground one. But back to Night of the Living Dead. The sense of disaster is very well thought out, and it's merciless as horror should be. In the early script draft that I read, the character of Tom's girlfriend wasn't present in the story, but in the movie his death in the truck is given a greater tragic framing by his girlfriend begging him not to go on the escape mission, and then she runs out on the mission and dies with him. So we feel a greater sense of loss. But immediately after this disaster, instead of a drawn-out "wasn't that sad" sequence, we cut straight to an even worse situation. Ben trapped alone out in the open, surrounded by a horde of zombies, and being locked out by Harry. Added to all this is that the destruction of the truck means there is no way of escaping to a government safe zone. So we have multiple disasters in the space of just a couple of minutes. Compound disaster, if you will. Then straight to Ben giving the traitorous Harry a beating, and then to the corpses of Tom and Judy being eaten. This film expertly keeps the narrative ball rolling very fast. Even in the final attack itself, there are additional revelations and aesthetics. The lights going out right before this attack is perfect timing, the darkness makes the attack more dramatic and scary, and the lights going out may have even motivated the zombies to go for the full attack. This was hinted at by them smashing the truck headlights earlier. They don't like the light. They also start collectively using weapons in this final attack, so that adds to their characters, so to speak. And Barbara's brother showing up after last being seen fighting with a zombie in the graveyard opening scene, that's great, a marvellous loop back to the beginning of the movie, but we'll come back to that later because it links to a very important theme. And character deaths are undignified as well. The common cliche of a protagonist who gives a glorious battle to the end, taking a bunch of enemies out with them. This works well in other genres like action, but not so well in horror. And this film thankfully goes in the opposite direction. Barbara, despite being the most terrified character, has probably the worst death, dragged out to be eaten alive with her own brother as the leader of the zombies. How horrible is that? At least Tom and Judy had a quick death. Harry, shot for his traitorous ways, then is partially eaten by his own daughter, and Helen stabbed to death by her daughter as well. This is a good surprise horror element because very few films have kids who kill, and killing their own parents is even more brutal. And finally Ben, unceremoniously shot between the eyes when mistaken for a zombie. After all he's been through in this movie, it's like a very sick cosmic joke, like the devil is watching over all of these events in the movie and making sure that everything goes wrong. For what Night of the Living Dead lacks in modern day special effects and gore, it easily makes up for it in how merciless the story is to every one of its central characters. And just after that final attack we have shots of dead trees, just as we had in the opening titles. It's quite fitting with the fact that everyone's dead. Good horror films also work better when there's a sense of impending and unavoidable doom. We've already hit upon multiple elements of this, but one of the best in this movie is Johnny tormenting his sister Barbara at the beginning, that some sort of monsters are going to come and get her.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbara.
Unavoidable creeping doom established right at the beginning. Ben tells a story of seeing a truck on fire and being trapped alone with zombies in the dark. And funnily enough, that's kind of what happens when their escape plan fails later. So was his story here just deliberately put in as foreshadowing? The news interviewee describing a corpse whose eyes suddenly open.
We had a cadaver from which all 4 limbs had been amputated. Sometime early this morning, it opened its eyes and began to move its trunk.
Ben will encounter this later in the basement. And probably my favourite little bit of foreshadowing in the movie is this. A radio report incidentally blurts out that the infection epidemic, quote, started with the slaying of a family of 7, end quote. Have a listen, it's just slipped in there.
A ghastly story began developing 2 days ago with the report of the slaying of a family of 7 in their rural home near Gulfport, Louisiana. Since then...
Why is that foreshadowing? Because there are 7 characters trapped in this house too, and all of them are going to die by the end of the movie. So this isn't just a dumb zombie movie, some genuine thought and effort has gone into its subliminal structure too. From the beginning of the film, a thematic implication is made that is separate from the basic plot. The notion that the souls of the dead are somehow offended by the living and are coming back to punish them. A small detail, possibly accidental, is the ruined condition of the cemetery sign at the beginning. In the comedy commentary on the DVD, it's suggested that this sign has been blasted with shotguns, and yeah, funnily enough, I thought that too when I saw it. Or is this mud? Why has no one even repaired this sign? Are they happy to let the sign become so unreadable that some visitors might not even find the cemetery in future? It's very conspicuous because we'd expect that the filmmakers would ensure this sign is fully readable. Johnny's dialogue in the first character scene consists almost exclusively of insults to the dead, including his own father.
Look at this thing. We still remember. I don't. You know, I don't even remember what the man looks like.
He carries on the insults at the grave itself, and as he does so, the rumble of thunder kicks in, like his dad is rolling in his grave in response to the insult.
Yeah, a little spit and polish. You can clean this up. Sell it next year. Wonder how many times we bought the same one. Hey, come on, Barb. Church was this morning, huh?
As Johnny starts tormenting Barbara that the dead are going to rise from their graves to get her, he sees and mocks a single roaming zombie who just happens to be a guy about the right age to be their father. I'm not saying he's literally their father, but the suggestion is there. This is supported by the fact that writer-director George A. Romero directed the mega-classic horror anthology movie Creepshow 14 years later. And in that movie, the very first story involves a dead father returning from the grave after being insulted by his daughter, who had killed him during an argument. Zombie Dad then goes on to kill other family members who were after his inheritance money. Back to Night of the Living Dead, Johnny tells of grandfather damning him to hell when he disrespected the dead as a child.
I jumped out at you from behind the tree, and Grandpa got all excited, and he shook his fist at me, and he said, "Boys, you'll be damned to hell."
As the father symbolising zombie attacks, we get thunder and lightning, which is missing from the rest of the zombie appearances later. Despite the thunder and lightning, it doesn't even rain. So it's like there's special psychological relevance with this particular zombie. The motive of zombies to eat the living seems to be sidelined here too. This zombie could just eat Johnny, but instead he chases Barbara like he has some sort of vendetta against her. But there is a contradiction in most zombie movies anyway, and that they don't try to eat each other. It's as if they know intellectually who's alive and who isn't. So there's always been a weird kind of revenge against the living element with zombies in these movies. This father-like zombie torments and chases Barbara for quite a long sequence, but then he disappears for most of the story. Ben kills several zombies in the yard, but for some reason Daddy Zombie isn't there, he's disappeared. Several scenes later, there's what I suspect to be a sneaky visual reference to the haunting father figure theme. Barbara enters one of the rooms in the house, and there's a photo of an older man on the fireplace next to what looks like an urn for holding dead relatives' ashes. Attention has been paid to props here because the clock says that it's 10 to midnight, and later the group await a broadcast due at 3 a.m. And in another overlap with Romero's movie Creepshow, a portrait of father above a fireplace is used, and this time with more prominence. Jumping way ahead to the ending zombie attack in which most of the characters die, Dad Zombie is briefly seen again, and it is clearly him in at least 2 shots. And he seems to be leading the effort to get to Barbara specifically, like he's back to haunt her. But then Father Zombie suddenly disappears, and the zombie version of her brother Johnny appears in his place. We can tell it's him because of the driving gloves that he used earlier, and it's he who drags her out to be eaten alive. So Johnny's original tauntings come true.
They're coming to get you, Barbara. They're coming for you, Barbara.
This subtext about Barbara's childhood fear of the living dead is separate from the main plotline in which the zombies are the result of radiation brought back to Earth by a Venus probe. But the radiation I consider to be a convenient justification to give the zombies a sense of narrative credibility, a cover for what the film is really about in psychological terms. The sequels to this film, which were also written and directed by George A. Romero, seem to have dispensed with the radiation origin plot point. So for now we have a kind of anger of the dead subtext, like these monsters want to punish the living for some reason. And so far the disrespect of the dead by the living, by Barbara's brother Johnny in particular, this is the most observable motive. 3 times in the Night of the Living Dead script, zombie behaviour is described using the word animal, while in the film, at one point the radio newscaster says the enemy, quote, look like people but act like animals, end quote.
Monsters, people who look like they're in a trance, and things that look like people but act like animals. Some I would...
Now, these animal references I'd be willing to wave off as nothing, but there is something else that carries stronger implication of meaning, and that is the animal heads and furs decorating one of the rooms. Far from being incidental, check out the big dramatic emphasis. Later on, she enters this room again, and one camera shot pans from the big teeth of a boar down to Barbara. This all makes sense, and the predatory animals kill their prey by biting and then eating them, and zombies pretty much do the same. We could just think of it as a subliminal foreshadowing inference regarding the eating of flesh, which doesn't occur until later in the film. And I found it funny that a pig head with fangs hovers over Tom in this scene when he's preparing for the mission that will see he and his girlfriend killed. And we have the overlap with metaphors in Romero's movie Creepshow, the conflict between a woman and her father who will later become a zombie. This is intercut with shots of stuffed animals. So these nasty animals might represent the horrible nature of the father. It's interesting that in some horror stories, zombies are the product of witchcraft associated to cannibalistic tribes. In fact, if I remember rightly, that was kind of the common zombie narrative drive in early zombie movies before Night of the Living Dead. And we do tend to describe cannibalistic tribes as acting like animals. And to that effect, I find it interesting that when the zombies are seen eating the dead in this film, the music becomes a trance-like electronic drum sound, almost tribal. In the follow-up movie Dawn of the Dead, the black character talks about his grandfather's belief in voodoo, and his claim that when there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth. So it's certainly possible that there's a very, very subtle tribalistic, cannibalistic voodoo undertone in the original Night of the Living Dead. Something else that seems to link in with this animalistic tribe theme is that as the story goes on, we start to see instances of zombies who have less clothes on, or are wearing night clothes that normally aren't worn in public. And in this instance, completely naked. Note that the woman is young and in decent shape. So was this just cynical exploitation by the filmmakers, a zombie you'd want to fuck, or is it part of an animalistic theme? After all, clothes are unique to human civilization. What other creatures on Earth wear clothes? I can't think of any. Oh, by the way, something else that links into nature itself is the sound of crickets, which is heard as an ambient backdrop in multiple scenes. They're even mentioned in the script a couple of times. It's quite common in horror movies to use the sound of crickets and other nighttime creatures to imply threats lurking in the dark, so nothing original there, but it's something. After the night is over and everyone is dead except Ben, who will soon die too, the sound of crickets is replaced with the chirping of birds. I'm not sure if that represents the zombies being happy that they've had their fill of flesh, or if it's a deliberately false allusion to a happy ending that isn't actually going to happen. There's always been a mysterious aspect to the motivation of flesh-eating zombies in movies. Why do they feel the need to eat? Why only eat the living and not each other? How do they tell the difference? What do they do after they've ate and they're full? Can they even digest food given that they're dead? I don't think I've ever seen a zombie take a crap in a movie either. The fact that they are hardly ever full skeleton zombies suggests that they cannot exist without a good deal of flesh on their bones, which suggests that their body is partially alive in some way. And in Day of the Dead, that idea was pushed with an effort to make it sound scientifically credible. Zombies simply don't make sense biologically, but they do represent something, or possibly many things. And one of the things I believe they represent is the mindless food craving of wild animals that forms part of our own evolutionary history. Make a civilized man starve and he will behave like an animal to survive, even becoming a cannibal if that's what it takes. Regardless of the other themes I've outlined, the greatest strength of Night of the Living Dead isn't the zombies, it's the human characters and how they interact. A lot of information is given about who they are and why they react the way they do, but it's easy to overlook because almost all of their dialogue involves them discussing the logistics of their situation and their plans for either escape or basic survival. The common scriptwriting blunder would be to have these characters make lots of outright statements of judgment about each other instead of demonstrating such traits indirectly, and to have them discuss their personal backgrounds, such as where they're from and what job they do. Oh, when I was a kid I had this experience and blah blah blah. The film avoids all this for the most part, and the good thing about that is it keeps the narrative locked into the zombie attack situation. To have them talking about past experiences would be a big distraction and would take away from the horror. But an even worse and unfortunately common scriptwriting mistake would be to divide the characters too clearly into boxes of right and wrong. In this respect, Night of the Living Dead plays some clever cards. Harry obviously comes off as somewhat irrational, cowardly, selfish, and even traitorous and vindictive toward others who don't do as he says, while his nemesis Ben appears on the surface to be calmer, more rational, and more proactive. So there's your black and white, and I'm not talking the ethnicity. Harry's body language is constantly tense, like he's going to hit someone. His voice tone is almost always aggressive. It's a really good acting performance by the aptly named Carl Hardman, who I'm sure I read was one of the producers of this movie. In fact, the titles state one of the producers as Hardman and Associates. That must be him. His dialogue, however, isn't nearly as nasty as his body language, and so a calmer performance could have been given to make him a more sympathetic character. Interesting that this actor, who was one of the film's producers, chose to play it that way. Ben, on the other hand, was written to be more of a white trash hillbilly type. Yes, a Caucasian, a white guy. But actor Dwayne Jones gave a strong enough audition performance that he was cast despite the fact that the ethnicity change massively altered the character. He conveys a more intelligent and mature Ben than what the script called for, but he does this mostly through physical performance and voice tone because his dialogue is mostly unaltered from the original script, where he was a white trash hillbilly. So we have two arch enemies, Ben and Harry, Ben as courageous, rational and sensitive to the needs of others, and Harry as the deplorable traitor who is brutish and cowardly in turns. On the basis of those character traits, we would expect Ben to be the one who manages to save people in this scenario, but he doesn't. Ben's escape plan results in Tom and Judy dying and the truck being destroyed. Harry's recommendation was that they all board up in the cellar and wait for help. It was a stupid idea in the respect that they would have no information from the outside world, but in the short term it would have been the safer option. Given that a posse of armed rescuers does actually show up in the morning and search the house, that posse would have come banging on the basement door shouting for whoever was in there to come out. When Ben gets locked down there, he's even able to hear dogs barking and sirens in the distance. None of these people knew when help was going to come though, so they could have all ended up stuck in the basement for a long time with a horde of zombies upstairs guaranteeing they would never escape. And Harry and Helen's daughter would definitely have died and become a zombie among them too. Despite all these arguments and logistics, Ben, when he's the last one alive, is forced to do what Harry said all along and retreat to the cellar. So when he wastes an extra 2 bullets on zombie Harry out of anger, how much of it is his frustration that perhaps Harry had the best idea to begin with, and that Ben himself might have even gotten everyone killed? It's a brilliant twist of events, and it speaks a truth that's not very common in fiction. Sometimes in life the best plans don't come from the nicest people. And one other point of Ben making a mistake is that he told Barbara to switch on all the lights upstairs, which may have acted as a beacon to attract more zombies. There are other occasional details that blur the morality line between Harry and Ben. The contrast between Ben the hero and Harry the traitor is more complex than it initially appears, but we'll come back to that in a moment. All in all, there are 7 non-zombie characters in this house, with one of them being the young girl, Karen. Being that she's sick from a bite injury, she has no dialogue at all, so we don't get to know her. But the other 6, while mostly appearing to be simple in themselves, have a complex and well thought out set of relationships with each other. And each has their own distinct character arc journey. I'll go through each of them in turn, and I'll start by adding some more points about Ben and then Harry. Alright, starting with Ben. An obvious point for discussion is the fact that he's a black man in a household full of white people, and he's their leader for the most part. But the racial theme I'm going to leave alone for now, as I'll be going more into that into the final part of this video. For now, I'll just say that on the surface, Ben's ethnicity is purely incidental. Black actor Dwayne Jones was wisely cast, but the story and dialogue were not altered in any way from the original script to make his race an issue. There is no racial abuse dialogue at all, not even when these characters are killing each other. Another physical appearance factor that I think has as much relevance and implication is that Ben is by far the tallest of the characters. I think this sits well with him being the most courageous, self-determined, independent-minded, and probably the most intelligent. He is quick to seek out resources like pulling doors off hinges and taking furniture apart to obtain wood for boarding up windows. Unlike Harry and friends who came to the house and went straight for locking themselves in the basement without adequate food and other resources, all they needed to do was spend 20 minutes just looking around upstairs and they would have found all kinds of stuff. Ben goes on a detailed search and finds an essential survival tool, the rifle. Rather than being paralysed by fear, Ben immediately identifies and prioritises the task of killing off the small number of zombies outside, setting a fire to scare them off. And he later reveals that he knew they would be scared of this because he'd already seen it in a gas station explosion. And he prioritises the task of securing the downstairs doors and windows. This was a lot of fast and complex thinking on his part, especially given the fear context and the fact that Barbara was too traumatised to help him. He had a lot to keep track of and he took control very quickly. Ben keeps up his positive and literally constructive can-do attitude right up until the final attack scene where he has to concede defeat and hide in the basement. He's capable of working alone to survive, but he's also willing and able to communicate with others when it comes to group survival. Every group needs some sort of leader to make decisions after the committee meetings have been held, and Ben knows it. As soon as he meets Harry and Tom for the first time, the essential task of sorting out who is and isn't boss is addressed, but it's not quite resolved. Tellingly, Ben and Harry are the ones holding weapons. With the shouting and accusations, the possibility of the weapons being used in this conflict is there, and Harry even raises his weapon several times during the arguments. An underlying threat of violence, but neither of these characters ever state verbally a violent threat. In fact, how much of Ben's comparative calm to Harry here is based on the fact that he's holding a gun and Harry is only holding a blade. Ben eventually decides he's had enough of discussing the issue and asserts his authority with shouting and personal insults.
If you're stupid enough to go die in that trap, that's your business. However, I am not stupid enough to follow you. It is tough for the kid that old man is so stupid. Now, you get the hell down in the cellar. You can be the boss down there. I'm boss up here.
We could view this as strength of character on his part, but I think a much better approach would be a diplomatic one. Instead, he enrages Harry when it wasn't needed, ensuring that Harry will be less cooperative later on. He could have just said, "Look man, I appreciate your point of view. How about you hang out downstairs? We'll try and secure up here. If we need you, we'll give you a knock. If you need anything from us, you come upstairs." You know, that would have assuaged Harry's competitive ego and maybe made the situation a lot better. When it does come to a group escape planned mainly by Ben and encouraged by the news broadcasts, Ben suddenly does become a lot more diplomatic. He gives Harry the task of throwing Molotovs out the windows and the all-important task of guarding the door and letting Ben and Tom back into the house after they refuel the truck. He hands over great responsibility, staking his own life on his trust in Harry. It's a powerful truce gesture, but ultimately it's a mistake. Assigning the door guarding task to the more trustworthy Tom would be a much better idea, except Tom is the one who knows how to handle the truck, and Harry's nervousness would make him unsuitable for accompanying Ben to the pump. These are really good motivational and logistic dynamics. There are other occasions as well in which Ben's integrity becomes open to question. He talks at length to Barbara of his personal trauma at first encountering zombies. She listens intently and doesn't interrupt him, but when she tries to describe her experience, he becomes very dismissive.
This man started walking up the road. I went up to this man, and I was going to apologize.
Why don't you just keep calm?
Strange of him to do that, being that he takes her under his wing throughout most of the film.
If you stay up here, you take orders from me, and that includes leaving the girl alone. It's on, it's on.
His personal investment in protecting Barbara plays out in interesting ways. When she freaks out, trying to leave the house to find her brother, he punches her out. Of course, she hit him first and he's trying to stop her getting killed herself. But when she wakes up, he puts a pair of shoes on her, which doubles up as a gesture that he still cares, and he talks to her as if he'd never even hit her in the first place. This is good scripting. It's better than having him just verbally apologise. Barbara, in her traumatic state, is reduced to a childlike demeanour, and this got me wondering if Ben's concern for her is somehow fatherly. He baby talks her quite a bit.
You have to go downstairs now, just for a little while, until we get back. Then we can all leave.
Oh, I'd like to leave.
And it made me wonder whether he has kids himself. And hey, there it is in the script. He does have kids, so maybe this taking Barbara under his wing, maybe that's him expressing his own concern regarding his children who he's not available to help. He doesn't seem to express so much concern about Harry's daughter, though.
The windows. Well, you're her father. If you're stupid enough to go die in that trap, that's your business. However, I am not stupid enough to follow you. It is tough for the kid that her old man is so stupid.
He doesn't even take time to go and have a look at the girl to see how she is, so by the time he finally lays eyes on Karen, she's already a zombie. However, he did offer to carry her if they have to leave the house.
You're gonna carry that child a mile through that army of things out there?
I can carry the kid.
Overall, despite the occasional attitude flaw, Ben puts up a good attempt to make the best of an awful situation. After Tom and Judy are killed, he's still trying to make constructive plans, while the others have conceded defeat.
You said those things turned your car over. You think we can get it back on its wheels and drive it? Where is it?
Seems like it was pretty far away.
But in the end, defeated physically and intellectually in that all of his plans have failed, Ben retreats to the basement and locks himself away alone, where he will have to listen for hours to the tormenting noise of zombies hammering away at the only escape door. Harry locking Ben out of the house and later holding Ben at gunpoint and about to leave him to be eaten by zombies, these two events reveal his traitorous side. However, his views and actions do have merit in places, and he even shows virtuous traits from time to time. During the argument over who is boss and whether to hide in the basement or not, Tom sides with Ben, but immediately after this, Harry's warning of not knowing where the zombie attacks will happen next is vindicated. From Harry's point of view, this is understandably taken as evidence that Ben's plan of staying upstairs is a bad idea. Even when he locks Ben outside, it's not all cut and dry in terms of morals. Ben kicks through the outer door and he and Harry make eye contact. Harry has a split-second decision here. Will he simply close and lock the basement door too and leave Ben upstairs? He could have done so, but he doesn't. He runs to help secure the outer door, knowing that Ben might even kill him for locking the first door. The script says here that after securing the door, Harry looks at Ben and, quote, knows what's coming, end quote. Although he takes a beating, he may have actually saved his own life here with his diplomatic about-face helping Ben to secure the door. Though very few personal history details are given, there are implications that Harry, even in the pre-zombie world, was a tortured soul. The way he shouts at his wife all the time, snatching cigarettes from her. At one point he appears to bully Barbara, and Ben chastises him for it.
You better watch this and try to understand what's going on. I don't want anyone's life on my hands.
Is there anything I can do to
I don't want to hear any more from you, mister.
Is that how he talks to his own family? Does he hate his family? At the same time, though, right before the escape attempt, it's Harry who insists that Barbara go downstairs where she'll be safe.
We better get her downstairs.
We have to go downstairs now, Barbara.
So maybe he does care, but just expresses it in the wrong ways. In fact, he and Ben clashed on this in another scene too.
I'm taking the girl with me.
You leave her here. Keep your hands off her. And everything else that's up here, too.
So is Harry a domestic abuser of his own family, even if only in the psychological sense? Helen makes a comment that supports this idea.
We may not enjoy living together, but dying together isn't going to solve anything.
So why do they live together? I think the most likely answer is that they have a child, plus this is the 1960s, a time when divorce was more frowned upon. Was Karen an unwanted child? Harry gives her very little direct attention and refers to her mostly as the kid, not my kid or my daughter, or even by her name, Karen. But an interesting turn in his behaviour is that as he's dying from a bullet wound, he tries desperately to reach his daughter, perhaps wanting to hold her for one final moment. In virtually every one of his scenes, Harry is either stomping about and shouting, or shaking and sweating with anxiety, and often compulsively wanting a cigarette. I'll bet that in their own original family home, he was a loudmouth dictator, preoccupied with controlling his wife and daughter. And by the way, he also wears a tie all the way through this film, even when he dies, so he obviously has some sort of office or clerical type job. You'd think he would just take his tie off at some point during this story to loosen up physically and mentally, but he doesn't. So maybe he's one of those guys who is boss in the office, and when he gets home from work treats his family like subordinates too. Whether he's an abusive father and husband or not, it seems that his desire to lock himself and his family in a dark basement might be a reflection of his attitude in general. Did he already have a habit of shutting out the world, of keeping himself and his family imprisoned in the emotional or physical sense, partly in fear of the world and partly afraid that his wife will leave him and take their daughter too? Before moving on to the other characters, I think it's worth a special mention that the failure of this group to survive can arguably be pinned on the ego clash between Harry and Ben, and they're both at fault. They were each half right about what to do. Ben was right to at least try and secure the upstairs to maintain access to news broadcast, food and other resources. Harry was right to use the cellar as a secure defence against an overwhelming zombie horde, but instead of a rational compromise, Harry calls Ben insane and Ben calls Harry stupid.
They won't be hard to fix.
You're insane. The cellar's the safest place.
It is tough for the kid that old man is so stupid.
This sets up a personal rivalry that compromises both of them intellectually, and it's quite true in life that even in dangerous situations, a lot of people still prioritise the war of ego over the war for practicality. Each side in turn makes the mistake of distorting the argument. For example, Harry claiming that there are millions of windows and doors to be defended.
Man, you're really crazy, you know that? You got 1,000,000 windows up here. Look at this. There's 1,000,000 weak spots up here.
Bit of an overstatement there. While at the same time, he complains that he can't see outside well enough because all of the defensive boarding. All he needed to do was go upstairs and look out the window for a broader view.
I can't see a damn thing. There could be 15 million of those things out there. That's how much good these windows are.
Make your mind up, Harry. Do you want the windows boarded up downstairs or not? When the final attack comes and the defences are crumbling, Ben should have just immediately switched to Harry's plan and ushered everybody into the basement, but he doesn't. Even after he shoots Harry, he should be ushering Helen and Barbara downstairs to safety, but he doesn't. Helen does make her way down a minute later, but Ben is upstairs wasting time. He could have killed the zombie daughter and saved himself, Barbara and Helen. So really, the responsibility for the whole group's failure to survive falls as much on Ben as it does Harry. What Helen says to Harry about his prioritisation of ego equally applies to Ben.
That's important, isn't it?
What?
To be right, everybody else to be wrong.
What do you mean by that?
He's wrong, you know. I'm not boxing myself in down there.
These kinds of complex and truthful subtleties in human interaction help elevate Night of the Living Dead way above most other movies. Let's look at the rest of the characters. I outlined previously the strange character arc for Barbara in that her childhood fears of graveyard ghosts come true. This frames her experience of the story as being entirely different to all the other characters, almost like she's in a different movie of her own. When she finds a dead body upstairs, its lidless eye is staring right at her as if she is being targeted by the dead. After experiencing the angry dead father symbolising zombie in the cemetery, she goes into shock and stays that way for most of the movie. In fact, she age regresses to the point where she is intellectually reduced almost to toddler age. It's like she's gone way back in time to even before the memory that her brother had triggered. Here she finds a child's music box playing a melody. Again, age regression. Here she plays with an armchair cover like a baby exploring the details of a mysterious new world. She clings onto walls and door frames as if to remind herself of physical reality. It's funny how humans sometimes do this when faced with great anxiety. Maybe they're worried that they'll faint and smack their head on the floor. She virtually forgets how to talk as well. When she does speak, there's not much sense to it. This scene in which she tries to talk about the graveyard attack is mostly ad-libbed, and actress Judith O'Dea does a great job. Like real trauma victims often do, she avoids thinking about the actual attack by describing lots of pointless details in the build-up.
We came to put a wreath on my father's grave, and he said, "Can I have some candy, Barbara?"
She gets hot as she builds up to recovering the worst part of the memory, and she misquotes what she and her brother actually said to each other in the scene. Yeah, memories can be very inaccurate. It's a good little character moment, and yet she flips into suicide mission denial of reality mode, wanting to rescue her brother, not wanting to acknowledge that he is already dead. The contrast between Barbara's response to the zombie attacks and that of the other characters is good, because in real life you can put 10 people in the same life-threatening situation and the responses will vary a great deal. Some put up an aggressive fight, while others will freeze like a rabbit in headlights, and will be entirely useless to themselves or others. Eventually she plucks up the courage to put up a fight, not for her own safety ironically, but for someone else's. And that's true to life as well. Some people can't stand up for themselves, but they'll fight for someone else. In a lot of movies, Barbara here would put up a big, respectable fight, showing that she was tough and resilient after all. But this movie isn't selling redemption fantasies. Barbara's moment of courage lasts a mere few seconds before she's grabbed and then confronted by the nightmare vision of her own brother coming to drag her out where she'll be eaten alive. Innocent, childlike Barbara's character arc is horrific in physical and psychological terms. Her death is likely the worst of anyone's in the story. The other character journeys are less complex than Ben, Harry and Barbara's, but they still have interesting facets. Children killing their parents in movies is very unusual, and on the rare occasions where it does happen, it can be psychologically powerful. The parent's victim is likely to be compromised by the love of their own child and thus more vulnerable to the attack. This plays out quite well in Night of the Living Dead because the right motivational cues are set up in advance. We find out that Helen and Harry aren't happy living together, so he may as well have been a zombie to begin with, and Helen tells Judy,
"She's all I have. Why don't you go upstairs now?"
So when Helen encounters her daughter Karen in zombie form, it's too much to take. She's just seen her husband shot, and now, seeing that not only is her daughter dead, but is also eating her husband, what a blow! And so she goes into denial. It's easy to look upon her as weak-minded here, but child-parent associations can be incredibly strong. The death of their child is something a lot of parents fear more than anything. Even when Ben encounters zombie Karen, he doesn't smash her like he does other zombies, he just pushes her onto the couch. It's like the instinct not to hurt a child remains, even if that child is a zombie. And one of the TV announcements earlier mentioned that even loved ones have to be burned immediately after death and that there will be no time for bereavement, so that plays quite well into Helen's moment of denial. I think that it might be a bit of a lost innocence crossover here as well with Barbara's journey. Barbara regressed to a child mentality and she gets eaten alive, and Karen was bitten by a zombie, suffers a slow death from the infection, and then kills her parents. So this zombie pandemic does not spare children. In reading up on reviews of Night of the Living Dead, I did find somewhere, and I can't remember where, an interpretation that some kids subconsciously want to kill their parents and that this is played out in Karen killing her mother. I'm not convinced that that's a theme in this movie, even though it's an interesting idea. The daughter doesn't have any dialogue at all that I can remember, and her face isn't shown in close-up hardly at all until she is already one of the Walking Dead, so I don't think the script is particularly orientated toward her experience. This film is exclusively about the adults, as far as I can tell. In fact, something odd I found in the script version I read is that the child is described as a boy in several scenes, and then suddenly switches halfway through the script to being a girl named Karen. It's like the gender change decision was made in the middle of writing the script, but the character was so unimportant that the earlier scenes weren't revised. A shame really, because I think more could have been done with this child character if she'd had some dialogue. Tom isn't as fleshed out in the story as Ben and Harry, and maybe that's part of the point. He's Piggy in the middle trying to bridge the gap between Ben and Harry. It's almost like he doesn't quite have a point of view that's his own.
You going down there with him?
Well,
Yes or no? This is your last chance. No beating around the bush.
Though Tom mostly takes Ben's side in the argument, neither he nor Harry were quick to open the basement door when Ben and Barbara could clearly be heard trying to board up the upstairs windows. They say they couldn't hear much, but that was garbage. Ben and Barbara had been talking right outside the basement door several times, and sometimes quite loud. And later Ben is able to hear distant dogs barking while he's in the cellar. So it seems that in the basement Tom had simply been subservient to Harry's will and let him be the boss. Seems like he's one of those guys who can't take charge without someone else to lead him. Almost the opposite of Harry actually. Harry listens to no one, but Tom listens too easily. And not too brainy it seems. Trying to drive the truck out the way when the gas had already set it on fire. No, that was stupid. His girlfriend is a match for him in that she's not too bright either, but she's a pleasant enough person. Running out among the zombies at last minute and hampering their plan, and she basically gets herself and Tom killed. Tom might have been grabbed by zombies the moment he got out the truck anyway, but if she'd have said earlier that she was going to be coming along on this mission, then she could have been given a weapon or some other useful role. However, just because characters aren't intelligent on the surface doesn't mean that they're not relatable. Judy anticipates the plan won't work and she doesn't want Tom to go, but she can't articulate her reasons for it. And just as Helen was emotionally compromised by her love for her daughter, Judy is in the same position regarding Tom. Dopey innocence. This scene gives us good emotional investment though in these simple but sweet people, and I suppose the fact that they die together is darkly romantic almost. So most of these trapped characters are intellectually quite simple on the surface and their dialogue convincingly reflects this, but nevertheless there's lots of engaging ideas in how they react to the situation, how they relate to each other, what their subconscious priorities are, and even what the zombie attack situation means to them. Like a lot of people in real life, they are capable of weighing up the pros and cons of a danger situation, and so their discussion of problem logistics is very good. It's how we would expect real people to react. A lot of movies get it the other way around by having characters be too articulate in relation to how stupidly they behave under a crisis. Though that can certainly happen in life too. At the end of the day though, this is a horror film, and so all of their plans fail and the things that they fear come true. Though the sequel Dawn of the Dead was packed with satire relating to consumerism, and the next film Day of the Dead was packed with commentary about humans are as sick and twisted as the zombies that they're fighting, I don't think of Night of the Living Dead as having nearly as much in the way of social or political themes. But there are small indicators that suggest George A. Romero already had in mind the various themes that were later manifested in his sequels. In the opening titles, Romero is credited as director at the very moment that a US flag appears close to the camera in the cemetery. As the flag moves off screen, his name fades out. I don't think this is a patriotic call, but rather a hint that the director is personally making some sort of statement about America itself. Maybe there's a suggestion here that the entire US is effectively now a cemetery, given the presence of zombies, although that's not necessarily a political commentary. The stuffed animals we already explored in relation to the idea of the zombies representing man's animalistic side, but it might be part of an animal cruelty theme. Romero's follow-up movie Dawn of the Dead has a scene in which characters raid a gun shop so that they can get enough firepower to kill every zombie in the shopping mall that they've captured. And in that gun shop, the heads of killed and stuffed animals are made prominent. And animal heads were shown in his movie Creepshow, relating to a nasty old guy who had killed his daughter's boyfriend in a supposed hunting accident. 3 Romero movies featuring prominent trophy animal heads. Something that has been discussed a lot in relation to Night of the Living Dead is the lead character Ben being a black guy. The film has been given praise for having a black character portrayed positively in a decade when it was rare in film. And though I don't think it was intended, this racial aspect likely offset the criticisms of violent gore. Night of the Living Dead was very extreme filmmaking in its day. However, the Ben character was written as a hillbilly trash white guy. Actor Dwayne Jones apparently was cast simply because he gave the best script reading and his dialogue was left the same as it was in the original script. So, other than Ben's visual appearance of being an African American, there's nothing in the dialogue to indicate any kind of racial tension. Even Nasty Harry doesn't make a single racial slur in this film. I think that in casting Jones, Romero knew that whether he wanted to or not, he would be introducing a racial equality theme, but instead of shoving it down the audience's throat or even delving into reverse discrimination, as often happens in movies today that try to push the issue, Romero wisely downplayed the issue, which ironically makes it more powerful. Instead, the racial theme is brought to the forefront only in the mostly dialogue-free ending. Ben hears dogs barking, and this made me think of Ku Klux Klan members hunting down black men on the run. However, the original script had Ben as a white guy hearing these dogs too, so probably there was no racial metaphor there. Ben comes upstairs and for some reason points his gun outside, even though he's already heard dogs and men's voices. Why is he scared if they're not zombies? At the same time, the trigger-happy hunters don't even shout to the house in case a human is in there, so they simply mistake him for a zombie and shoot him dead. This death happens in the same way for white Ben in the script and black Ben in the film. But what follows in the film is very odd. A series of still shots of the hunters sticking meat hooks into Ben's corpse and dragging him off to be thrown on a crematory fire. We can hear the hooks rip into the flesh.
Keep those dogs back off of those things!
And finish with live footage of the bonfire. Although this was in the script, I find it impossible to watch this scene without getting the feeling that this is a statement about violent racism in America, at least at the time the film was made. The use of still shots makes it seem like a news report, like a snapshot of history. The racial theme interpretation is given even more weight by Romero's later movies. In Dawn of the Dead, one of the 4 central characters is a tough, smart black guy, but his ethnicity is never commented on. However, in the opening scenes of the same movie, a racist cop goes on a killing rampage against blacks and Puerto Ricans, shouting racial slurs and blowing people away. And hunters of zombies are shown having fun and are described as rednecks. The lead hunter in Night of the Living Dead is a kind of swaggering John Wayne type too. And there's the final story in Romero's anthology horror film Creepshow. A nasty old guy, a white guy, has locked himself away from the world, fearing bugs. And the only other character we actually see is a black janitor seen through a spy hole in his door. He won't even open the door to this guy. The whole Creepshow episode is about racism. See my video on it for a detailed breakdown. And the racist old guy character, he's strangely similar to Harry. Harry has a desire to hide from zombies in a basement instead of hiding from roaches. I don't know if that's like an intended crossover, but interesting. Moving on from racial themes, the presentation of women in Night of the Living Dead is amusingly old school. Barbara is useless, barely able to string a sentence together. Helen seems to be more resourceful, but she just lays there later on and lets herself be killed by a child zombie. And Tom's girlfriend Judy arguably gets him killed. Women are useless in this movie to the point that when Harry lists the problems that they are facing in their escape plan, he lists women as a burden rather than an asset.
How could we possibly get away from here? We've got a sick child, 2 women.
Given the women's tendency toward denial and ineffective action in this film, I suppose he's right. Romero updated this attitude to women in Dawn of the Dead. A pregnant female character is viewed as kind of irrelevant by the males until she insists on learning to fly a helicopter, and she even does some sharpshooting from a rooftop. In the next movie, Day of the Dead, Romero made the lead protagonist an action woman, and this was in 1985. This came a year before Sigourney Weaver's iconic tough female protagonist in Jim Cameron's Aliens. So Romero beat Jim Cameron to it, even though Aliens is of course the superior movie. The issue of how governments handle a crisis is presented with surprising authenticity in Night of the Living Dead. It doesn't come off as a warning against the dangers of martial law as far as I can tell, but from what I recall, one of Romero's later zombie movies, I think it was Land of the Dead, had themes about rich versus poor, with the zombies essentially representing the poor and a martial law police state in the making as a result of the zombie apocalypse. And that brings us to the final theme that I want to explore in Night of the Living Dead: empathy for zombies. Zombies are smashed in the head, burned, shot, and hacked at with blades. They're not supposed to feel pain, but in a couple of scenes when they are shot in the head, they hold their hands up to their head as if they do feel pain. I think this was likely just a cover-up for the lack of bullet impact special effects. I mean, if someone got shot in the head through the brain, I don't think the body would be able to respond by putting the hands up to the head if the brain was dead. But there is a strange moment here. Ben slams a tire iron through a zombie's forehead. This zombie should be completely dead according to the rules laid out in this movie. If you kill the brain, you kill the zombie. And yet this one's eyes are still moving. This is just before he is dragged out and set on fire, presumably conscious. So what's going on here? Is this a crossover with Ben being shot in the head and then burned on a bonfire, suggesting that he was still part conscious when he was burned? I really don't know, but there's something going on there. This zombie's brain was destroyed and its eyes clearly move afterwards. What I like about all these vague themes in Night of the Living Dead, the animal stuff, the racial issues, the tribal voodoo implications, the political commentary, and all the rest of it, is that it's downplayed to the point that most of it is only noticeable if you really pay attention. The sequel films brought most of these same themes to the conscious surface, sometimes making them too obvious for my tastes, but the sequels do at least provide an indirect verification of what was already there in the first movie, if only in seed form. Night of the Living Dead was a groundbreaking movie in its day on more levels than even the critics realised. It had the gore, it had the positive black protagonist, it had the true horror framing in which none of the central characters survive, but it had more layers of sophistication that were missed. And those layers are still missed. They're locked in the basement, only to be found by the viewers who explore the darkness. Thanks for watching. You've been listening to Rob Ager. Hope you enjoyed this. More film analysis over on my website, collativelearning.com. Bye bye.